Good evening. It's intermission time. Our service is friendly and quick. You'll find hot dogs, hamburgers, pizza, your favorite candies, hot and cold beverages, and other delicious snacks. So add to your fun of watching the movie. Visit our refreshment stand right now. We're glad to have you with us tonight. We hope you'll come to see us often. It's great to get out to the movies.
Hello and welcome to Vintage Pop. This is the Vintage Pop Podcast. I'm your host, Greg May. This is our 5th episode, which means we've had a full month under our belts. We talked about that a little in our previous show when we were doing our Television Pioneers program. But now I am happy to announce that we are on our 5th episode of Vintage Pop. We've had a bit of a jump in listeners, so welcome in if this is your first time or your second time listening to the podcast. And Vintage Pop is a podcast hosted by me. The show is dedicated to bringing you the stuff you missed from yesterday from someone who was not there for it the first time around. It's a fun and informative look into the pop culture of yesterday. Movies, books, music, and TV. And in some cases, as in this episode, certain things that were available in a certain time period, such as rides or the drive-in theater. All eras will be talked about. If you have any suggestions, comments, concerns, if you want to suggest a topic to talk about, the email address is vintagepopcast@gmail.com, vintagepopcast@gmail.com. You can also reach us at Twitter @vintagepopcast. Again, it's @vintagepopcast. And the best way that you can keep up with our notes for the show, they do update if you follow us on iTunes, but if you get it elsewhere, the best way that you can actually access the notes and I post a lot of links of things that you can look into that we're talking about on the show. So the best way you can access those notes are vintagepop-podcast.blogspot.com. That's vintagepop-podcast.blogspot.com. We also have an Amazon search bar there, and I ask that you use our search bar. It's really easy. Once you get our Blogspot in your bookmarks, just click it, type in what you're looking for on Amazon. We get a couple cents on the dollar for each sale that you each purchase that you make on Amazon, and that helps to keep the lights on if and when we ever actually get someone to use the search bar. So please use the search bar. Today's episode, actually, the first part of it comes as a suggestion. A friend of the show, listener, Dan Richmond, he actually suggested a documentary to me earlier on this week called Drive-In Movie Memories. Drive-In Movie Memories is a documentary from 2001 based off of 2 books, Drive-In Movie Memories, Popcorn and Romance Under the Stars by Don Sanders, as well as the American Movie Theater, the American Drive-In Movie Theater, that is, which came out in 1997 by Don Sanders and his wife Susan Sanders. So we'll talk about the Drive-In Movie Memories first. We'll then follow up with something that's been popping into my head every now and then, and that is looking and researching vintage ride attractions. There is a YouTube channel that kind of sparked my interest in general called Defunct Land, and I'll leave a note for that in the show notes as well. We won't be talking about Defunct Land in particular today, but it did spark my interest in researching attractions from theme parks that I might have gone to as a child or theme parks that I never actually even experienced as a kid that I just want to look into now. With that being said, recently I heard that the Great Movie Ride that was originally in what was called Disney's MGM Studios, now Disney Hollywood Studios, actually closed back in 2017, this previous year. That's a ride that I enjoyed quite a bit growing up. I went to the Disney parks twice in the 90s and then again for senior trip in the 2000s. So I wanted to do a tribute to the Great Movie Ride and talk about that a little bit. So we'll talk about the Drive-In Memories as well as the Great Movie Ride. We'll do a retrospective on the Great Movie Ride, talk about when it started, talk about some of the things that you could see. I also have links so that you can actually watch an entire video of the ride as it was taking place. There are many links on YouTube, but this one in particular is from 1989 when the park first opened, and I think that's the best way for you to be able to experience what it might have been like to ride on that ride when it first started. I will add also, if this is your first time listening to the podcast, we're available on Stitcher. We're also available on Podbean as well. The podcast is from Libsyn. So if you go on vintagepop.libsyn.com, you can get the RSS feed that way and post it into however you like to consume podcasts or download them. As I said in our in the beginning of the program and a little bit in the last program, we've seen a little bit of a jump in the downloads, so that's really great to see. A big thank you to all the support throughout the show so far, and I think we're really getting into a rhythm here. I'm really also enjoying suggestions for topics. Sometimes when you're busy during the week, it's hard to come up with something exactly that you might want to talk about, and being able to have suggestions from listeners and friends really does help out. It kind of steers me into the direction of what people want to hear, what people are nostalgic about, and what things need to be talked about. And I really what I want is to get everybody in on the conversation. So please feel free to email us at vintagepopcast@gmail.com. Again, that's vintagepopcast@gmail.com. So that'll do it for the intro of the show. Oh, actually, by the way, too, there was a secret cinema event this previous Thursday. I was plugging it a little bit in the last show called The March of Time. We'll talk about that. The 16 millimeter projector is dropped off and is potentially awaiting repair. So we'll talk about that as well as we close out the show, as we always do. So we'll take our first break. When we return, we will talk about drive-in memories. Then we will switch over to the Great Movie Ride and a little update on myself right here on Vintage Pop.
Show starts in 7 minutes.
And I think of them now, of course, from my vantage point years after going to them, as a wonderful part of Americana.
It was a great era.
I love the look of them.
You could put your seat back and put your feet up and be comfy and cozy.
It was big escapism. This is where the guy who worked all day in the
packed the
railroad
kids up in the station wagon.
And you just kind of kick back and you watch the movie. And it's just great.
Have a good old smoochy time.
I wanted to do everything but watch the movie.
My mother and father were in the car, and if we were
play at the playground,
watch Star Wars
and drive-in movies.
at a drive-in, then
just get the hell out of this world and back to one. And
a drive-in movie, I think you remember as you would your first kiss, your first car, your prom. Those innocent times that you spent as a child with your family.
Well, welcome back to Vintage Pop. I'm your host, Greg May. And, it's funny, actually, the little segue that I always play in the middle of our intro and then the first topic that we always talk about is actually an intermission timer for drive-ins. So, actually, I've always had an interest in drive-ins, and it's funny, I was sitting out at the bar in 1984 in Wilmington that I normally go to, and I was talking to my friend Dan, who was actually also a listener of the show. You may remember he talked to us a little bit about Evel Knievel. He left us an email, and he suggested that I check out this drive-in movie documentary. It's called Drive-In Memories. It came out in 2001, and as I said in the intro, it was pulled the information from two books, Drive-In Movie Memories, Popcorn and Romance Under the Stars, which was released in 2000 by Don Sanders. And then there is another book, The American Drive-In Movie Theater, by Don Sanders and his wife, Susan Sanders. So both of these books are available on Amazon. I can leave some links for those if you want to learn more about the drive-in. But the drive-in was alive and well ever since the 1930s is what I found out. And I've always had an interest in drive-ins. Actually, local to the Philadelphia area, the closest drive-in that you could go to would be the Delsey Drive-In, which is in Vineland, New Jersey. They still show first-run movies. There's another one in Western Pennsylvania called the Mahoning Drive-In, and that is the drive-in that you probably want to go to if you live around here. Actually, even if you live closer to the Ohio area, it's probably about the same difference if you were coming from the eastern side of Ohio or the western side of New Jersey, Delaware, or the Philadelphia area. It would probably take you about the same amount of time to get there. It's definitely over 3 hours from where I am, but they do still show 35 millimeter prints of older movies, so that's really cool to see, honestly. And I would like to go there at some point. That would be really nice. So we're talking about Drive-In Movie Memories, as I said, came out in 2001. Some of the people that they talked to in this documentary, Leonard Maltin, Samuel Arkoff from American International Pictures. You may definitely recognize some of his name for sure if you watched a lot of B movies. Joe Bob Briggs from Monster Vision is talked to in this documentary. He goes by his real name, John Bloom, in the documentary, but they do put a little parentheses, Joe Bob Briggs. So it's a really cool documentary that starts from the beginning of drive-ins and kind of takes you up to where it is as of 2001, but I don't think that much has changed since 2001 and now. Drive-ins, for the most part, are basically gone, other than some of the ones that I told you about. I'm sure there's little niche ones here around the country depending on where you are, but they did start in the 1930s in Camden, New Jersey. I forget what the guy's first name was, but his name was something Hollingshead. And what's crazy was he came up with this idea to drive in and see a movie outside because according to the documentary, his mother was too overweight to fit in chairs at a traditional movie theater. So that way she never even had to leave the car. She could just get in the car and watch the movies. So his idea of starting drive-ins exploded into the design of the drive-in, how you would leave the pavement elevated so that you could see the screen and make it easier for others to see the screen depending on where you're parked. And he actually patented this idea because he thought he would be able to get rich off of it. He was going to license out this design of drive-ins out to other people that potentially would like to build a drive-in, and then he would potentially get rich off of these ideas. But as time went on, it turned out that he was not legally able to renew the patent, and that way he was not able to maybe be as rich as he probably wanted to based off of his idea. But it's crazy how so many different things come back to the tri-state area here. I swear I don't do this on purpose, but I do talk about all kinds of different things, and they all happen to take place either in New York or Philadelphia or Camden. And like I said, I don't do that by choice, but it is really neat to see that the first drive-in, or what you could call a drive-in, at least according to this documentary, was in Camden in the 1930s. So we're still talking about this and how drive-ins went from an idea that this guy in Camden had, and it really started to boom after the Second World War. But before that, once this patent expired, the documentary goes on to say how this was kind of a small town local business owner type of thing. Maybe you were a barber and you wanted to invest in showing movies, and they keep going over and over and over the course of this documentary and talking about how land was so cheap when this idea first came about, and how you were able to purchase large amounts of land. Farmers were able to do this and own a drive-in, put up a big screen, pick up some older prints of films, set up a projectionist booth, and you have a drive-in. Now, these drive-ins in the 30s were somewhat primitive. They weren't all like what we were talking about with this guy Hollingshead's plans with grading the concrete and making sure it was able to house all kinds of different cars so that you could see the screen no matter where you were. A lot of these were just put out in the field. They were talking about how it was so muddy and cars would get stuck if it was a rainy day. They were talking about how the snack stands, and probably one of the most fun things I like to watch are intermissions on YouTube that talk about snack stands. And they talk about in the 30s how things were so primitive. You were lucky if you got a bag of popcorn back then. But seeing these prices, was like 35 cents a car to get into these drive-ins. And what actually was amazing to me was that the documentary goes on to talk about how people actually would live behind the screen. They would build a house in the screen housing in the drive-in theater. That way they wouldn't have to drive too far from town to go to their job. They already lived where the job was. So And in these days, too, a lot of these drive-ins, they've said, were in the middle of nowhere. So the postman would have to deliver the prints, or they would have to send somebody from the drive-in into town to pick up these film prints. Or sometimes the mailman would say to the milkman, if you're going out there, we're going to give you the prints. You go and drop them off at the drive-in. So that's the early days of drive-in. And then what we come to know, or what most people have nostalgia for the drive-in, didn't really start until after World War II. And this is when it became a more of a bigger business venture. Corporations were starting to get into this. It was not exactly just a small town thing anymore. And this is when you start to see these drive-ins popping up with the correct cement grading and lanes so that you could fit as much as possible, very big, large screens. And these were starting to pop up in residential areas. This is when you start to get the snack stands like you would traditionally think of. The documentary goes and shows big neon signs with bright lights and would try and draw in people to come see these movies. People like Joe Bob Briggs and Leonard Maltin go on to talk about in the documentary of how big this was and how much of an event it was in a community for people to go and socialize with one another before the movie started, and then go in and sit in their car and be able to enjoy a movie. It was a family experience. You could bring your kids. They talk about how they would bring kids in pajamas with the hope that they would fall asleep in the back seat of the car. I've heard stories from so many people that are a little older than me that talk about how they got away with seeing scarier movies because their parents might have thought that they were asleep when they went to the drive-in, and it turned out that they actually stayed awake and maybe they saw a movie that they shouldn't have. It's really a shame that I was not able to experience this in its full form, and I have not even been to the drive-ins that are close to me, and it's something maybe I'd like to do when the movies get nicer. But they started talking about in the documentary too about all these wacky things that they would do to try and make things more comfortable for people. Drizzle guards that you could put on your car in case it would rain. Mosquito repellent, how you could burn something on your dashboard that would keep the mosquitoes away. I guess similar to citronella candles. In-car heaters and air conditioning units. When you hear about the air conditioning units and the tubes that they use, that was really gross, but I don't want to give it away, but the payoff is great about what would happen. I mean, you think about it. The tube that's been sitting outside, you can probably put two and two together and know that there's been all kinds of stuff that might have been able to crawl in there when they weren't exactly sitting in your car window. They talk about how there was all kinds of different things as well to try and draw people in before the drive-in started, before the movie started properly, because a lot of people were starting to complain about the noise. They would have to turn down the noise, or there was regulations against it. In towns, when the daylight savings first started, they thought that the daylight savings time would kill the drive-ins because it would be so much later into the evening that people would not be able to get there, or that it would be too late for them. So what the drive-in needed to start to do is start doing some type of gimmick to get people into the door so that they would spend more time at the drive-in. And these were things like playgrounds and small rides and petting zoos and being able to like ride horses. And it's amazing once you watch it to see all of these gimmicks and the footage. A lot of it looks like it was like 16 millimeter or 35 millimeter home movies, probably more or less if it's a home movie, 16 millimeter. If they were shooting some type of promotional thing, 35 millimeter. And I knew that it was such a large social event, but I didn't know the scope of how big the drive-in was, even for stars. It turns out that the world premiere of Blazing Saddles was actually done in a drive-in in the California, I guess close to Los Angeles, but it was in California that they did a world premiere of Blazing Saddles at a drive-in. So obviously nothing lasts forever, and they show the kind of decline of the drive-ins after a while. Real estate became expensive, as we all know how expensive real estate can be, and it just was not economically feasible for some of these drive-in theaters to stay open. Some turned to showing adult films, some's closed altogether. And it was interesting some of the business tactics that they used. Some would even host swap meets or flea markets, as you would think of them, at the lots where drive-ins took place during the day as extra income. And they talk about how this would have actually kept the drive-ins alive a little bit, because the space is being used up and they're being able to make more money off the space rather than just showing movies. So like I said, there was a downturn as we got closer, and they say the biggest thing was probably the VCR and how you could watch movies at home, though I still don't understand. It's not like you could ever get a new movie on VHS when it first came out. And I think there's something special about the drive-in and the social aspect that it carries with it, that people were able to go and experience all these things and have a great time with their family. And I think we've lost a lot of that, the social aspect that we have had with one another back in the day when we weren't so tied into the internet and our cell phones and social media. And don't get me wrong, the internet is great. I mean, without the internet, I would not be able to talk to you about things from the past. But there are some things that I think it has limited us as a culture and socially with others. There's a book by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone that I can put in the show notes. I actually just picked it up again. I read it in college. And what it goes on to talk about is how us as a society, and for the namesake, we'll start with that, Bowling Alone, how there were things like bowling leagues and PTA meetings and social groups and Lions clubs and all different types of things that were in towns that people would go to try and be social with one another, that people don't quite exactly do anymore. There are small groups here or there, but a lot of things, even some of the stuff that I follow, different video formats or things, video games or other things that I talk about in a nostalgic sense, I'm talking to people online. Now, these groups are great because it puts me in contact with people that I might not have been able to find other than the fact that they are on the internet. I think it does take some socialization away in a face-to-face sense. Even when it comes down to dating, now people use online dating apps. But I guess I'm kind of getting off base, but the main point of this is that the drive-in seemed like a place where everybody could get together as a family and enjoy themselves. And it's a time in our history that I don't think, even if I go to one that's in Vineland or one that's 2 hours away from me and they are showing older films, I don't think I'll ever be able to experience that nostalgic feel of the drive-in. And for people that are older than me and did, I truly envy the fact that you were able to. But it seems like a wonderful time and a place to have been in. The documentary, again, was Drive-In Movie Memories, came out in 2001. There's 2 books by the same people, Drive-In Movie Memories, Popcorn and Romance Under the Stars, as well as the American Drive-In Movie Theater. Both came out between the late 90s and the 2000s. And just looking, you should check out some of the suggestions in Amazon as well, as they talk about Cinema Under the Stars, America's Love Affair with Drive-In Movie Theaters, as well as Drive-In Movie Memories, which we talked about, and the American Drive-In History and Folklore of the Drive-In Restaurant. Also, coming at going attractions, the definitive story of the American Drive-In movie, which is a Roger Corman DVD. So definitely just go to Amazon once I post these links and check out some of these suggestions. I think I'm going to as well. And it looks like there's plenty of stuff to talk about, and maybe further come back to this topic at another time, which would be really great. I wanted to actually read you guys a quick review because, it's not always that we are able to have a conversation with others, but through the power of the internet, which I complained so much about. There's no real review that I could find. Sometimes I find stuff from the New York Times when we talk about movies, or sometimes we talk about things from Variety. But this is a user review from IMDb, and the review is titled The Passion Pit, and it reads like this. Drive-In Movie Memories by Don and Susan Sanders, the book and the documentary, harks back to fonder days. I grew up haunting the local drive-in before it succumbed to home video and became a weekend flea market. And it's impossible to sit through a documentary like Drive-In Movie Memories, or even the sadder Drive-In Blues, which I guess we'll have to check out, without breaking down and bawling like a baby. I went for the ambiance, to sit and watch the summer sunset while 50s rock and roll wafted from the speakers in the still of the night by the Five Satins was a favorite, and kids played on the monkey bars of the merry-go-round near the screen, where the parents could keep an eye on them. There would be trains that passed through at some point, some nights more than once, and one would often see the kids seated on the embankment between the surrounding fence and the railroad tracks, watching the movies for free, and no one bothered to run them off. They were quiet and respectful, like devotees paying homage to some ancient vision. My favorites, of course, were the all-night horathons, which began at dusk and ended in dawn, It was, to coin a phrase, a film facts world, where oldies like the original Night of the Living Dead played alongside then current fright films of varying quality. Watching movies like American Hot Wax or American Graffiti, and you'll understand the kind of longing documentaries like this one engender. I have an old black and white photo taped to my desk, a postcard actually, and it's a photo we see in drive-in movie memories. There's a single automobile waiting outside for the very first drive-in in this country to open. I look at that old photo and it takes me back, not that far for sure, but back to a time when there still were drive-ins, and on a quiet summer night as the sun set, you could hear the Five Satins crooning in the still of the night. That was by Poe426. He wrote that review January 12th, 2015, and I think it really encompasses what we've been trying to talk about and what this documentary and these books really are trying to talk about, and try and give you a little bit of what it was like to experience the drive-in if you were there, or perhaps if you're more towards my age and you never got to experience. So that's Drive-In Memories 2001. We'll put it in the show notes. Definitely, I highly recommend checking it out. It is on Amazon. If you have Amazon Prime, you can watch it for free. Also, if you don't have Amazon Prime, I will post it. There is a link of it on YouTube as well. So that was kind of long-winded, but I actually really got caught up in this, and I really enjoyed the documentary that I watched last night. Another thanks to Dan Richmond for recommending that documentary to me. So we'll take our second break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the great movie ride that was once at MGM Studios, now Disney's Hollywood Studios in Orlando, Florida. We'll talk about the history of that ride and more right here on Vintage Pop.
The Great Movie Ride is one of the highlights of the Disney MGM Studios theme park. Visitors find themselves right in the middle of the action in such great films as Raiders of the Lost Ark, Alien, and The Wizard of Oz.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog, too.
You know, that movie ride was really great. I'm ready to go again.
You know, that's the special thing about the movies. You can always go back again and relive all those wonderful memories.
When you think about it, movies have a lot to do with the way we live. And what about the way we talk? And the way we dress?
The way we walk?
Wait, the way we walk? Don't you think that's getting just a little carried away?
I guess maybe you're right. Hey, why don't I treat you all to a soda at the Brown Derby?
Okay.
Shall we?
Welcome back to Vintage Pop, and we just had a wonderful segment on drive-in theaters, and here's a good segue. How about a ride about movies that you drive through? And that's the Great Movie Ride, which was a dark ride attraction that was at Disney's MGM Studios, now known as Disney's Hollywood Studios, between May 1st, 1989 and August 13th, 2017. And I wanted to talk about it because I saw a link for it on YouTube yesterday, actually, and it said that and when I did a quick Google search, I found out that the Great Movie Ride closed August 13th of last year to make way for a new ride, Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway. Don't really know how much better that's going to be than the Great Movie Ride. I guess only time will tell. But the whole reason that I was actually even interested in looking at old attractions is, firstly, I've always been very interested in the retro attractions that were at Walt Disney World, either things that I experienced growing up or things that maybe I had missed. But it seems that there is a general interest in nostalgia for defunct theme park attractions. I was trying to think of what the right word would be, but yeah, that would be defunct theme park attractions. And really the biggest channel that's doing it right now that is new on my radar is Defunctland, which is done by a guy named Kevin Perjurer. And he does all kinds of different shorts, I would call them short documentaries on different topics regarding theme park attractions that are no longer available to the public. They can't either they can't go on them, or they've been changed so much that they're unrecognizable, hence they are defunct. He's covered stuff from Disney World. He's also covered things from the UK. There was one in the UK for a place called Alton Towers, a ride called the Black Hole that's no longer around. But so it's very interesting. I'll put the channel show link in the show notes so that you can check it out. But this is definitely something that's always sparked my interest, something that I've been interested in. And when I found out that the Great Movie Ride was no longer going to be around, I was actually pretty upset about it when I found out yesterday, because I thought it was always something that, I thoroughly enjoyed, and I thought a lot of people enjoyed. But I guess what really comes down to it is that people's interests change, the zeitgeist changes, and some of these things might not exactly be in the mind of people that are visiting the park, some of the younger kids that maybe had the same thoughts or ideas about movies that maybe perhaps when you and I were growing up. So we'll get into it. The Great Movie Ride was a dark ride attraction. It was located at Disney's MGM Studios, now Disney's Hollywood Studios, in Walt Disney World Resort. The attraction employed the use of audio animatronic figures, practical sets, live actors, special effects, and projections to recreate iconic scenes from 12 classic films throughout motion picture history. The attraction debuted in the park May 1st, 1989, and was located inside a replica of Grauman's Chinese Theater, which is obviously one of Hollywood's most famous movie palaces. It was originally developed by Walt Disney Imagineering as a pavilion for the Future World section of Epcot, which is my personal favorite theme park in the Walt Disney World Resort, under the direction of Michael Eisner and Marty Sklar. The concept was expanded into a third theme park, which became MGM Studios after a licensing agreement with MGM. In 2015, Turner Classic Movies took over sponsoring the attraction until its close in 2017. So the films that were shown on the ride were Footlight Parade, Singing in the Rain, Mary Poppins, The Public Enemy, The Dollars Trilogy with Clint Eastwood, The Searchers, Alien, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Tarzan the Ape Man, Casablanca, Fantasia, and The Wizard of Oz, which is the finale. And then what it would do is at the end you would see a whole montage of films towards the end of the ride that would be projected on a screen. So a little more history on the ride. 3 separate attempts were made by Walt Disney Imagineering to bring the Great Movie Ride to California. First were plans to incorporate the attraction into the proposed Disney MGM Studio Backlot project, which was a 40-acre film studio-themed retail and entertainment district that was planned but never was built for downtown Burbank, California in the late 1980s. Several years later, plans called for the ride to serve as a centerpiece of the proposed Hollywoodland at Disneyland, which would have been added to the park during the planned Disney decade in the 1990s, but due to budget costs, however, Hollywoodland was canceled. Later plans called for the ride to be built as part of the Hollywood Pictures backlot area of the Disney's California Adventure Park theme park at the Disneyland Resort, but budget cuts in the park's original development planned the ride's proposed cost to be spent on smaller, original, and less expensive attractions. Unlike many Disney dark rides that feature separate embarkation and debarkation areas, the Great Movie Ride had only one single combined unloading and loading areas. The last people to exit the vehicles often passed the next group of guests waiting to board the vehicles. At the time of the ride being designed, it was common throughout the theme park industry to have all major rides exit into a store selling merchandise associated with the attraction. The Great Movie Ride, however, did not exit directly into a store, instead allowed guests to directly exit back outside the park. So you'll see in the video when you watch it, the entire ride unfold, as well as walking through the queue line. And the queue line shows all kinds of props as you walk through it, displaying different movie props throughout the history of film. And I think this is a ride that really had some character in the park. And I think that's a problem with the Disney parks going forward. I understand that it's Disney World and that the audiences are changing and there's different things that people are interested in that maybe perhaps I was not when I was growing up. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of these things had a lot of character, and it's stuff that sits in people's memory. And it's a shame to see that it's gone. But thankfully, YouTube is a great service for this type of stuff that allows you to go on. And I watched a wonderful video from 1989, what the opening day ride looked like. And it really gives you an idea of what it was like when it first opened. If you want to see something towards the later end, there's another channel that I have been looking at, and that is called martinsvids.net. I'm assuming he has a website by that as well. But what's cool about it is all different things from all the different Disney parks. I'm currently watching a video on the land from Epcot Center. There's a playlist of Epcot Center's Future World. There's another playlist for There's No Place Like World Showcase. There's another one for fireworks, parades, Christmas time, and Halloween. But if you do look at the uploads, there's ones for Spaceship Earth, as well as the new Star Wars ride, which if you're not feeling, if more or less that's not nostalgic yet, but there is Muppet Vision from MGM Studios, which is another one of my favorite rides. A tribute to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, a tribute to The Timekeeper, Mission to Mars, Carousel of Progress, and a full walkthrough of Disney MGM Studios and what it used to look like. So really, this guy is doing a great service. And I really recommend that you check out his channel if you want to get a better look at what some of the Disney park attractions were like in their heyday before that they were defunct and no longer there. So martinsvids.net on YouTube, as well as Defunctland on YouTube, to see more about this type of stuff. So we'll take one final break. When we return, I'll give you a little update of what's been going on with me, and then we will close out the show like we normally do with some upcoming events in the area right here on Vintage Pop.
Now, join James Mason for an intimate look at Hollywood's fabulous years. Television as you like it. Tonight at 8, here on Channel 9.
Welcome back to Vintage Pop. So some great segments that we talked about today, the drive-in memories from 2001 documentary, as well as the great movie ride, which unfortunately closed in 2017. Great things to talk about. Great topics that were, one recommended to me by Dan and one that I was able to pick up on YouTube. As always, if you have any suggestions that you would like to talk about on the show or that you would just like to hear discussed, the email is vintagepopcast@gmail.com. You can always DM me at vintagepopcast on Twitter as well. It says, always, I'd like to give you a little update of what's been going on with me. And same old, still trying to get the 16mm projector stuff going. As of last week, I did drop off the projector to a local collector who's going to try and figure out what's going on with it. Hopefully, I'll be able to get that running. Believe it or not, apparently, we're only 8 days away from spring. If you live in the tri-state area, we're apparently going to get another nor'easter today. And there's apparently more snow in the forecast. But I'm hoping that we start moving towards nicer weather because I am looking forward to the spring and being able to sit outside and screen some movies and vintage TV shows and features and shorts for people to enjoy with this projector. So as soon as I get that off the ground, I'll be really happy with that. So if you were at the Secret Cinema, it was a great event at the Rotunda on Walnut Street last Thursday. If you were not there, though, I will tell you it was a really great time. It was a retrospective of the March of Time, the groundbreaking influential series of topical newsreels made by a film pioneer produced under the banner of Time and Life magazines between 1935 and 1951. The March of Time presented fast-moving, concise summations of crucial current events and vivid histories of facets of life and trends in America. They showed some that was on the cotton industry in the South, which was very wild to see. Another on potential careers for females, which was actually fairly progressive for 1949. And there was also ones about teaching in the country and how low the pay is, and actually how relatively low the pay is now. There were two additional shorts that were shown that were made by the March of Time Productions people, but also not entirely affiliated with the March of Time. One was a 1946 short called Atomic Power, which was quite remarkable according to Raymond Fielding in his book about the series The March of Time 1935 to 1951, which I actually just picked up after the program. And it actually was just marked ship as I was recording the podcast. I can put a link in the show notes so that you can take a look at that when If you're interested in the March of Time, or you know about the March of Time, and you'd like to read more about it, you can check it out there. But it definitely was a really great show. Was able to actually pick up a book called Hitchcock Truffaut, which has been around since the 60s. It's a new pressing or new printing of the book that has recently come out. You can actually pick it up in Barnes & Noble, but I picked it up at a local record store in Philadelphia for $11. So that was a great find, and that's definitely a big tip for those of you out there that like to read about vintage stuff and really look for more information. Amazon is your biggest source. You can check out used books on Amazon all the time. They got plenty of great stuff that you can check out. But your biggest friend, if you can find them, are your record stores, because you can go to the record store. Not only do they sell DVDs, they obviously they sell vinyl records. They sell your DVDs, vinyl records, CDs, cassette tapes, 8 tracks, possibly anything vintage that you could possibly think of, VHS tapes, and even laser discs. But the biggest thing lately I've been noticing at record stores are their selection of books. And the books aren't just music books, but they're also books about movies and television and different pop culture things. So definitely, if you're impatient and you want a book now, feel free to just go on Amazon and order it. And hopefully, I try and always look for Prime links so that I can get them in 2 days, because even though I might not read them right away, I kind of like to thumb through them, especially these coffee table books like this Hitchcock Truffaut, which is a manuscript of an interview between Francois Truffaut and Alfred Hitchcock in the 60s about just the two of them talking about his movies and movies in general. So I'm looking forward to looking through that. Obviously, we talked about the Leonard Maltin book about shorts a couple weeks ago. That's in a show note for a previous episode. If you want to check it out, it's all at the blog page at vintagepop-blogspot.com. So some upcoming events. There will be another Secret Cinema event actually next week. It will be Tuesday, March 20th, which will be next Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. Admission is free. It's at the Woodmere Art Museum, 9201 Germantown Avenue in Philadelphia. It will be a big B-Picture double feature at Chestnut Hill Film Group's screening. The program is called B-Picture Double Feature, consisting of 2 brisk-paced genre features from the 1940s plus surprise short subjects. It'll be their 3rd double feature show that they've ever done at the CHFG. The double feature includes 2 films with close to 1 hour running times and combined wartime espionage with an intriguing look at the then new social problem. There will be 1 complete screening at 7:30 p.m. Admission is free, as I said, and the Chestnut Hill Film Group is Philadelphia's longest running repertory cinema series. There are 2 descriptions of the films on the website, thesecretcinema.com. Youth Runs Wild from 1944, produced by Val Lewton, which you might know from I Walked with a Zombie or Cat People, as well as Madame Spy, directed by Roy William Neal from 1942. So those 2 events, Tuesday, March 20th, those 2 features one night, Tuesday, March 20th at 7:30 at the Woodmere Art Museum, 9201 Germantown Avenue, Philadelphia. April 13th, again, Suspiria, the 35mm print, will be 7 p.m. at the Lightbox Film Center in Philadelphia. You really do not want to miss that. It's going to be a really rare print of the film. And just seeing some screen grabs from it on YouTube and people that have been posting them online, the colors look beautiful. So if you live in the area and you have the chance to check it out, I highly recommend checking it out. So again, before we go, if you have any suggestions, you can email us, vintagepopcast@gmail.com. That's vintagepopcast@gmail.com. @vintagepop on Twitter. We're available at Stitcher, Podbean, iTunes. Please, please, please leave us a review. Type it out. Give us a rating. It really helps out the show and kind of gets us out there for more listeners. So listeners are growing, and I'm really excited about that. But the more people we get, the more suggestions we get, the more we can have these conversations about vintage things and really keep this show alive. I really appreciate all the support that I've been getting from friends and other listeners of the show. The blog page, vintagepop-podcast.blogspot.com, if you want to research more of our show notes. And there's plenty of show notes and different videos to look through. I will try and assemble everything that I can to cover a lot of what we talked about today so that you can keep it going for yourself. And you have some things to talk about if you want to shoot us an email. Again, it's at vintagepopcast@gmail.com. So I'm your host, Greg May. This has been Vintage Pop, and we'll talk to you next time. Have a great week.